Well, I think as a society we become insulated, and we sort of build these silos around what we know or who we know, and we just haven't broken through those barriers of inclusiveness and people interacting together. So once there is something that happens to any group, we then fall back into our encampments, I feel. So somehow we have to break down the walls or the cultural walls in order for people to be able to interact and not, when there is an incident, fall back on their group and have more social action to the whole community and change the whole community as opposed to one part of the community. I think there is validity in talking about that because in order to understand different groups, you have to be part of the group and you do have to change. And in order to enact change, I think you have to go into different groups or cultures or encampments. And I don't think you can talk about a culture unless you know a part of the culture in order to know the whole culture. So yes, you can say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but you still have to know what those parts are and influence them in order to bring value to each of those parts, in this case, the parts of society. So I think there is value. I think we have to be aware of those things, and we have to go about changing those things in order to have a better good or a change for the larger society. It goes back to reflection and awareness that there is discrimination and there is bias, and what do you have to do to change that bias in different groups in order for there to be a betterment of the greater society.
Okay.
So if there is profiling, if there is discrimination, what can we do then to counteract that bias and discrimination, and that will have a greater effect and value-added impact on the greater society? Denying that, I think, is the worst thing that can happen. I think the modern use of the sit-in, I think, is important. I think the public display of protest is important. But sometimes these actions take a life of their own as opposed to incorporating other ways to interact, to learn, to create social action together. It's not just protesting and sitting in, it's actually doing something positive to change the way we interact and to change society and the structures that are there. So how do you take those protests on the street and actually create something good out of them into social action and change? It's not just saying, this is wrong, what are we going to do now in terms of action? How are we going to be counted in terms of our actions in order to change those things? Part of my viewpoint in terms of how cultures and again being tolerant and accepting has to do with some of the incidences in Jewish history, particularly in Germany. In the 1800s, during the Reform movement in Germany, the Old Testament began to be translated into German. Mendelssohn did that huge event. Actually, all the services then were in German. The hope was then the German Jews would be accepted as Germans. Yes, Jewish, but Germans, instead of looking at tolerance and acceptance of diversity. Subsequently, I think we all know what happened with the rise of Hitler. No matter how integrated or assimilated the Jews were, they were still profiled. They were still, again, targeted for annihilation and the Holocaust. So assimilation didn't matter. Looking more German didn't matter. It was a society that wasn't accepting of the diversity that was the issue. So that's why I do believe that society needs to change. The viewpoint of people need to change in terms of more tolerance and more acceptance. Well, I think a good example has to do with discipline in schools. You know, there's so much now research done taking zero tolerance for any deviancy in behavior and people being punished, and we saw what happened. If you change that policy and change that viewpoint in terms of zero tolerance and more teaching and mentoring, we see now that incidents of suspension keeping kids in school is now up, and actually suspensions are down, and that's going to help the graduation rate. So a change in our viewpoint, change in policy, also had a change in the way people were looked at and their completion and success in our school system, which is the greatest representation of our penal system, because it is a reflection. Our school system was based on our penal system as well. So as a microcosm, look at that and use that for the greater society.
Okay.
Solve things at a couple of levels below where they should be solved. And I think we need to look at our system, our viewpoints, and be aware of that and acknowledge those shortcomings. And it's only through the awareness of that and admitting that then change is going to occur down the road.